Hello, my name is Olurotimi Osha. I like to talk about US history and I talk about American presidents as well. We are roughly 37 days into the US Israeli war with Iran following the decapitation on February 28th, 2026, of Iran's leadership. Of course, I done a video just discussing Iran's gunning down of some U.S. warplanes. Uh, there was one uh, pilot who had been missing, and the U.S. has been successful in rescuing the fighter pilot. So thank God, that's wonderful. He's been rescued despite the bounty, 60,000, circa $60,000 bounty the Iranians had uh, issued for his capture. But he's safely in U.S. arms, and was they pulled off a bravado, a stunning rescue effort, right? The stuff of movies, right? The stuff of Rambo, John Rambo movies, However, uh, the uh, the cost of the war is escalating, and it is said that the U.S. actually blew up two C-130s, each costing $100 million. So that's $200 million blown up, and that's counting the $140 million lost when the Iranians gunned down aircraft. So over the past few days, America's lost over $340 million in aircraft. So the cost, of course, of the war is rising, it's mounting, and that's part of Iran's asymmetric warfare. But that's not what I want to talk about today. Today, I want to talk about how America got involved in Iran in the first place. I'm going to talk about the history, since Iran was England's cup of tea, was Britain's cup of tea, not America's. I have done a video talking about how um, the a British businessman, multimillionaire named William Knox Darcy, had won a concession agreement, and then he struck oil in 1908. He had this agreement in which the Iranians were getting just roughly 16% of the oil profits. They were not satisfied, and we all know over time. Uh, there was most people know about the Prime Minister Mossadegh, who nationalized uh, the uh, the uh, what was it called? The Anglo Iranian Oil Company in 1952, 53. The 1950s, he nationalized the oil company anyway. And of course, even though it wasn't, America was not involved there, but the British had initially been trying to uh, orchestrate a coup to oust the Prime Minister Mossadegh, and he got wind of this, and he kicked out all the British expatriates there. And so when he did that, um, it forced the British uh, to invite the CIA, and one of the people that was spoken to was Kermit Roosevelt, and that's who I'm going to be talking about. Kermit Roosevelt Jr. was uh, our 26th president's grandson. He was grandson of uh, Teddy Roosevelt. So before I get into all of that, I might as well just tell the story. His bio is kind of interesting. Um, so Kermit Roosevelt was born into the Roosevelt clan. His father's name was Kermit as well. He was Kermit Jr. He had a son who was Kermit as well. That son had a son who was Kermit. So Kermit is, it's funny. I don't know if anybody's seen the Muppet Show. I was a fan of the avid viewer of the Muppet Show when I was a kid. I didn't so much like Sesame Street, but I loved the Muppet Show, and the protagonist or the smartest of the Muppets was a frog named Kermit. It wasn't a frog, so I always assumed Kermit was the name of a frog. The only Kermit human beings I know that are Kermit are these Roosevelts, right? The grandson of uh, uh, Teddy Roosevelt and his son and his great grandson. So they all go by Kermit. Um, in any way, that's not to disparage them or anything like that. But Kermit the Frog, yeah, of the Muppet Show, he used to be, to me, he seemed he was portrayed as the smartest of the Muppets, right? He was normally a leading figure, and there was Miss Piggy, who was who was smitten with him and was always trying to seduce him or whatever it was she tried to do. I don't know what a Muppet would try to do, but Kermit the Frog. There was Bert, right? Bert and Ernie, right? Bert. I think Bert was the biggest square. He was a square. He wasn't not quite as clever, obviously clever as Kermit the Frog. But back to Kermit Roosevelt, and I'm talking about a real person, Kermit Roosevelt Jr. He was born in Buenos Aires, Argentina, on February 16, 1916. And of course, his impact, he would be renowned for his overseas activities, but in the Middle East, right? In the Middle East. So his bio is interesting. He went to Harvard University like his father and grandfather. Of course, we all know the Roosevelt clan. Again, uh, Teddy Roosevelt, of course, was uncle to Eleanor Roosevelt, who was married to her cousin, Franklin Roosevelt, who was number 32, our 32nd president, and the only president to serve four terms. So they were our Dutch presidents, but they weren't. Teddy wasn't our first Dutch president. Martin Van Buren was our first Dutch president, right? Martin Van Buren was our eighth president. He was a Dutch as well. So, and they're from New York. So New York was a big Roosevelt. It was a big. It had a huge Dutch presence. I've done a video explaining how um, New York was actually founded by the Dutch, and the British seized it sometime in the mid 17th century. In the mid 17th century, was it 1664? I can't quite remember. Please don't quote me. Yeah, these dates, lots of dates to remember, but it was in the 17th century, prior to our independence, the British would seize the Dutch colony. Um, and make it, British, a crown colony. So, excuse me. That's Kermit Roosevelt. He went to Harvard University. After graduating, he taught history at Caltech. So he taught history at Caltech. His father would die when he was 27. His father actually committed suicide. So his father had been in the military, accomplished, but he committed suicide when he was quite young. Depression was kind of ran the in the line of Teddy Roosevelt, in the Roosevelt's Teddy Roosevelt's line. So um, And then during the war, the outbreak of the war, Kermit Roosevelt Jr. would join the Office of Strategic Services, which was the precursor of the CIA. Of course, the Office of Strategic Services would change and become the CIA. While he was there, he actually wrote a history of the firm. That's the Office of Strategic Services, which became the CIA. I've actually started reading a copy of that, which is rather interesting. And of course, at some point after the war, following the war, he started to do some things that were rather interesting in the Middle East. In New York, he met with the Council of a Jewish council, and he would form an organization called the Committee for Peace and Justice, right? The Committee for Peace and Justice in the Holy Land. And so, obviously, so what they were focused on was they were trying to prevent the partitioning of the of Palestine. They were trying to stop the creation of a Jewish and then an Arab Palestine. They were trying to stop that. That was the objective. Um, this was around the 1948 after the State of Israel was created, right? Interestingly, a few years later, around 1951, he would form another organization that was now pro-Arab, right? So he was instrumental in founding and was on the board of these two uh, organizations that had conflicting viewpoints. So you could see. So the second organization he formed was the American Friends of the Middle East, right? And they were pro Arab, right? They were pro Arab. They propagandized for Arab nationalism. So you start to see the moral flexibility, right, traits of the CIA. How they do two conflicting things in their activities, right? Um, I don't want to digress, but this was something that he was doing, and so I guess that was the beginning of his involvement in the Middle East. He also wrote an interesting essay, which I've read. I should probably do another video just discussing that essay. He wrote an essay titled "Partition of Palestine," right? A lesson in a lesson on pressure politics. Yeah, partition of Palestine, partition of Palestine, a lesson on pressure politics. So I'm going to do another video and discuss that. Um, in any event, later on, he would get in. He would be promoted as a director. When the around 1953, Eisenhower would become president, and significantly, Allen Dulles at that time was the head of the CIA. He was director of the CIA, and his brother was the Secretary of State, is John Foster Dulles. So these two guys, by the way, Allen Dulles and his brother John Foster Dulles, who was Secretary of State at the time. Allen Dulles was a director of the CIA, head of the CIA. These two men actually graduated from my law school, George Washington University Law School. I thought that was kind of like, so you get an idea how GW is a big federal government school, right? It's a big feeder for the federal government. So for people, lawyers who are interested in federal government work, they probably want to go to GW. It's a great place to be able to network or, get in to the federal government. Not that if you get into Harvard or Columbia or any of those schools, you won't get into the federal government. Of course, you will. In any event, I digress. So Eisenhower was president, and something interesting happened. Prime Minister Mossadegh had nationalized the oil company. He was actually supported by a Marxist Leninist party, a communist party. And so again, there was a conflict between the British and the Iranians. The British owned 51% of the Anglo-Iranian oil company. It used to be Anglo-Persian oil company. It was switched to Anglo-Iranian oil company. Now, Mossadegh was dissatisfied with the 16%, which the Iranian government had. The father of the incumbent Shah at the time, that's Mohammad Reza Pahlavi's father. Reza Shah had been dissatisfied as well. At some point, he wanted to nationalize the company, oil company as well. I think he had put pressure. I think he probably got some kind of change. But there was also something else that was going on. The British, right, the British government, which owned 51% of the um, Anglo Iranian oil company, which would become British Petroleum, by the way, they never showed the Iranians the books, right? So they didn't show them the books. So the Iranians didn't know how much they were actually making, right? They just got a number saying, well, this is your end of the bargain. Meanwhile, the Americans had, of course, they had created Saudi Aramco, right, with uh, in Saudi Arabia, and they split the profits 50-50. They had a better deal with the Saudi Arabians. And I guess that was motivating the Iranians to try and get a similar deal. In any event, when they couldn't negotiate successfully, um, Mossadegh would nationalize the oil company. And at that time, the British started plotting, MI6 started plotting the overthrow of Mossadegh. Interestingly, much later on, by the way, much later on, this is a sidebar. Uh, Much later on, after he'd retired from the CIA, that's Kermit Roosevelt, he would write his memoirs, his account called Counter Coup, about what happened. And of course, he had to submit the book he was writing. He had to submit it to the CIA for authorization, right? Because this is clandestine, classified stuff he worked on, and the CIA would redact. Um, would do a lot of redactions and revisions and have him change stuff. And reviewers would say that what he wrote was sort of like a knockoff fictionalized account, something else. John Le Carre is a famous French spy novelist, right? Something, an Ian Fleming, so, someone, a crime spy author would write, some kind of fictitious novel. Um, because he did something that was kind of funny. So when he released the book, after its initial release, there was a recall. There was a recall. It was in 1979. It was released in 1979. He left the CIA in 1958. Right, he was still rather young. He was probably just about 42 years old. And when he left the CIA, by the way, he went to work for oil and defense companies. So you can see how those companies are, right, pretty much linked. They're pretty much entrenched with people who moved around the CIA. People who've worked in CIA like to move work in those spheres, oil and defense companies, right? So he writes this book, but the CIA revises it, uh, and the revised version said, because the CIA didn't want to implicate the MI6 in which was actually the organization that was involved in the coup to overthrow Mossadegh. They're the ones who had approached the CIA. So instead, what Kermit did was he wrote that it was British Petroleum. Um, it was the Anglo Iranian Oil Company, right, which was the predecessor of which became British Petroleum. So he wrote that they were the ones who planned the coup, who orchestrated the coup, which was bizarre. And so um, the book had to be recalled, and that had to be corrected. In any event, the book, they said, the revisions made it seem like a work of fiction, right? I thought that was just rather interesting. Um, so Kermit then gets involved with, he was invited by MI6, because MI6 had initially planned uh, to orchestrating a coup to overthrow Mossadegh. And however, Mossadegh got wind of this, and he kicked the British out of Iran, right, to foil the coup. And so the Americans were there. So the British then approached the Americans, right? And so, interestingly, something that's very interesting, prior to the Iranian coup, so it's a landmark um, operation for the Americans as well, because Americans had never orchestrated a coup to overthrow a government. So that's the first time the CIA entirely managed and orchestrated a coup to overthrow a foreign government. So Kermit Roosevelt is very significant. Is very significant. He's a monumental, sort of, you can call it that, in what would later become like a mainstay of CIA's foreign involvement. You know, the CIA would later become like an expert in overthrowing governments in third world countries. Um, Now, prior to that, what they'd done was they had acted as technical advisors or consultants, or giving financial support and just been on the sidelines. They'd never actually engineered and orchestrated, instigated, and done all the work to overthrow a foreign government. Notably, they'd helped, assisted in a Syrian overthrow, the coup in Syria, um, and in Cuba, right? So they just maybe provided funding, right, but not really doing anything operationally. But in this case, Kermit would work operationally, and he would create what was called a false flag operation, right? A false flag operation. So he staged events and made it seem like it was the Iranian military establishment that did a coup to overthrow Mossadegh, while apparently he was the one he organized the agitators, the agents provocateurs who would get in the streets and start protesting. And there was actually a shootout, and like 200 people were killed. He orchestrated the whole 9 yards, everything. He was the one who pressured the prime minister, the Shah at the time, the Shah, who was forced to actually flee in exile. Um, that's Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He forced him to issue two what's called firmans, or decrees, terminating um, terminating uh, Prime Minister Mohammed Mossadegh, and then appointing a guy called Zaledi, who was his cousin, by the way. Sahidi was his cousin. Um, he was a military officer and he was a cousin. Fortunately for Mossadegh, he wasn't assassinated, and I think it was probably because the military officer who overthrew him and installed himself as prime minister, uh, you know, was his cousin. Um, Now, why did America get interested? Because it wasn't America's cup of tea. This was British terrain. America didn't have any investments in Iran. It was the British government that owned 51% of the oil fields there, by virtue of owning 51% of the Anglo Iranian oil company. Well, one, the Americans had been persuaded by the British that Mossadegh was sort of influenced by the communists, and they were getting ready for some kind of communist takeover, of course. And Americans didn't want that. This was the height of the Cold War, and so America was trying to get, since the Iranians were already kicking out, getting rid of the British. Americans wanted to still be able to ensure that Iran was within their own orbit, right? Within their own sphere of influence, instead of losing them to the USSR. That was one. That was their main motivation. That was why it got the approval of Eisenhower and the director of the CIA. Um, and then there was the other issue. America felt didn't want didn't like the idea that Iran could just nationalize their oil company since they had interest in Saudi Arabia, right? They had an interest in Saudi Arabia through Saudi Aramco, and they had a 50-50 deal. If They didn't want the Saudis to get the idea that they too could just nationalize, uh, you know, their oil, their companies and kick Americans out. So that was, they didn't want to create an environment in Iran that was going to send, the wrong signals, right, to other Arab states where they had interests. That was one as well. That was another reason. Um, yeah, and the other thing is, without a doubt, it appears that Kermit also had some kind of prejudice against um, Mossadegh. He sort of has so Mossadegh in some kind of caricature manner because Mossadegh was said to be an eccentric, and America, he'd been able to persuade the U.S. Leadership that, well, that he was some kind of unstable eccentric, right? And even though it kind of interesting, he did have a good cordial relationship um, with NASA, right? NASA had been part of some young officers, free officers, they call themselves, who overthrew the monarch, right, in Egypt in 1952, and then they eventually abolished the monarchy entirely in 1953. NASA was behind the scenes, but he became the leader in later on, and he had a close, cordial relationship uh, with Kermit Roosevelt. But for some reason, um, uh, Kermit Roosevelt viewed Mossadegh as some kind of a caricature, an eccentric caricature, an unstable caricature, and especially since he had this leanings, he tended to lean to. He had a communist base that supported him. It made it made him feel very uncomfortable, and so he he just he he made sure to have him overthrown. So he orchestrated the coup, and he got the support of the military establishment and the clerics, right, the Muslim clerics, right. Eventually, Mossadegh was overthrown. Um, Now I'm gonna do another video, and so when Mossadegh was overthrown, it helped consolidate the power of the Shah Mohammed Reza Pahlavi, who had initially fled into exile. So when he returned, he actually popped champagne, um, and he said he owed, he had a toast to um, Kermit Roosevelt, and he said he owed his throne to God, his country, his army, and to Kermit Roosevelt. Kermit Roosevelt got all sorts of accolades, for pulling off the coup. It was like sort of the stuff of Robert Ludlum movies, some great spy novel, and he got accolades from even figures like Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was, I think he'd suffered a stroke at the time, was prime minister, but he got praised by Winston Churchill and all the way to the top of the U.S. government. He would get a National Service Medal, I think it's called. He would be, secretly awarded a medal for pulling it off. For orchestrating the coup. But what he'd also done was he'd laid the seed for the 1979 revolution of the clerics. Because the Iranians were very nationalistic, right? They were very nationalistic, and so they tried to get rid of the British. They didn't like the idea of being an appendage or a tool of Western powers or foreign powers, and so initially they preferred the Americans, right? They thought the Americans were helping them to get rid of the British, right? Foreign influence, because at the time the Americans didn't have any interest, right? They didn't have any interest in their oil. They didn't have any direct interest like the British did. But much later on, the clerics, the Iranians, the nationalists, they realized that they just basically replaced one foreign power with another foreign power. That's the Americans. Um, my name is Oluro Timiosha. I'll continue with my discussion on uh, Kermit Roosevelt's clandestine activities in Iran. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.